Licensing Committee. Can I ask for apologies for absence, please? Jennifer? Apologies for absence. Oh, sorry.
No apologies.
Okay. Members, are there any declarations of interest, please? Provost, your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't have any declaration of interest, but I wonder if we could consider rearranging the agenda to take the item that concerns the police first, so that we can deal with the business and then they can leave, and then we can deal with the next item, which is administrative.
Can I come in here? It's quite difficult to do that because the first item is a public item and we record the first part of the meeting. Okay. So the recording would then need to be stopped and then restarted and then stopped. So it's actually much more difficult to take a public item after the private items. So on this occasion, I think we need to just go with what's on the agenda, if that's okay with everybody.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. I think there's no declarations of interest. Item 3 in the agenda is changes to the driver's knowledge test report from the clerk, and the paper is in front of you. Jerry.
Thank you, Chair. Members of the committee, this is quite a simple report. In March 2021, decision was taken by the then licensing committee to adopt a knowledge test for private hire car and taxi drivers. The knowledge test comprised two parts, a practical element and a written element, and the idea was obviously to ensure that drivers had an appropriate working knowledge of the local area for the benefit of any customers that they may drive around it. What we've seen over the years as a result of various factors has been the creation of a backlog of these tests, to the extent that we currently issue licences conditional on the knowledge test being taken within a period thereafter. The ideal was that this period would not exceed beyond 6 months, but given staffing issues, the backlog has drifted beyond that in some cases. In order to address this, the proposal being put to the committee this morning is to adapt the knowledge test from its current format, i.e. the practical and the written element, to just a written element. This will ensure that the knowledge of the local area is assessed, but it will be able to be done in a much more efficient and economic way from the Council's perspective, in the sense that we can have multiple applicants sit the test at the same time, rather than each individual applicant going out with the Civic Licensing Enforcement Officer on individual drives, which is obviously time-consuming, labour-intensive, and in part has resulted in the backlog that we now face. So essentially the committee are being asked to authorise me as clerk to revise the current knowledge test process, adopt a purely written test format, and to utilise that new written process for all current outstanding tests and any tests for new applications received into the future. It's suggested to the committee that, in essence, the need for a practical test is effectively absorbed in the written test. It's about knowledge of the local area. It's not about the person's ability to drive. That's already been assessed in terms of them holding a current driving licence. And so we don't feel that the practical element is essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Before I go to members' questions, could I ask Mr. Gilpatrick if he wants to add anything further as the administrative officer?
Thank you, Chair. When we first introduced the practical knowledge test, it was specifically because I'd been approached by someone who had failed the written test that we had at that time on 3 separate occasions. And the reason he'd failed it wasn't because he didn't know the area. He'd been operating as a private hire driver for 8 years prior to that. The applicant's issue at that time was the fact that he was dyslexic, and when he was put in front of a written paper, it made no sense to him whatsoever. So after consultation with our senior solicitor at that time, it was agreed that I could take the person himself out and do a practical test to ensure that he knew the area. And indeed it proved very, very successful. unfortunately for myself, too successful. Granted, at that time we only required knowledge tests for applicants for taxi driver's licences. But as Mr Mahan has said, in 2021 we extended that to take in applicants for both taxi and private hire car drivers. In view of the number of applicants that we get for private hire driver tests, we did very, very quickly build up quite a large backlog, of well over 100, and this was obviously added to by the fact that for a long period of time we weren't working from the office, so I was unable to actually go out with anyone and do a knowledge test at that time. The written test, I have no issues with bringing it back in. We have tried approximately a year ago, where we brought in, over the course of the day, 72 people for a knowledge test. It was unfortunately a fairly poor result, as we only ended up with 3 people who passed. But we will still give them the opportunity to sit the test again to confirm that they are aware of the area. And indeed, in terms of the people who form the backlog, they've now been operating as private hire drivers or taxi drivers for some time, so they should have built up a reasonable knowledge of the East Renfrewshire area and be able to find their way around and indeed answer the questions that will be on the test papers.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, I think we'll have brief questions from members about this. Councillor MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. To my knowledge, as I understand it, the fees that are charged for a private hire car licence are exactly the same as that of a taxi licence, both for the driver and for the vehicle. So it beggars the question, I suppose, is if we're going to bring in a knowledge test for private hire drivers, why would somebody go for a private hire badge and car plate rather than just a taxi plate? Because the taxis can come to house calls and pick up on the street, and therefore does it not render the whole idea of private hire badges and taxi plates obsolete in that respect? Thanks.
I suppose, Councillor, that's a matter for the individual applicant. If they want to apply for a private hire driver's licence, then they're perfectly entitled to do so. I think that the bottom line in terms of the knowledge test, which is what we're discussing today, is that the knowledge test was applicable to taxi drivers up until 2021. We didn't have the mechanism to make it a requirement for private hire drivers. There was a change in legislation, and it was decided, given the volume of our private hire fleet as opposed to taxi fleet, that it was an appropriate thing to introduce for those individuals. I take your point regarding the distinctions between the two, but the reality is that individuals are entitled to apply for one or the other, and indeed choose to do so.
Provost.
Thank you very much. Councillor MacDonald's point seems to be a fair one. I'm not sure why the knowledge test isn't applied to both sets of taxi or private hire. I just wonder why it's concentrated on private hire.
I think, sorry, Provost, it is applied to both. The knowledge test is applicable to both taxi and to private hire. The point I was making is that some time ago the legislation changed. Prior to that it was only applicable to taxis. After that we had the discretion to extend it to private hires, which we did.
Can I ask you to clarify, if a person, is the application process entirely the same for both a taxi and a private hire? Because, as Councillor MacDonald just made, it seems a bit redundant to have separate applications, because if the application process and the cost is exactly the same, everybody should want to have a taxi licence because they can pick up people on the street, whereas with a private hire they can't. So I And I don't understand the logic in having the two categories.
The issue that we faced here is the fact that under the terms of the legislation and the conditions that we operate with, East Renfrewshire Council is allowed to operate a maximum of 77 public hire licences.
So why is that relevant to that?
Because
my point.
well, at present we have over 500 drivers licensed with us. So if everybody got a taxi driver's license and they wanted a taxi, then there would be in excess of 400 people being disappointed.
I see. So there is a rationing, basically, of the number of taxis as compared to private hire. I understand that. That's very helpful. Thank you. Okay. I think, Provost, if you have no further questions, I'll move on to Councillor Morrison, please.
I can wait until after Councillor Morrison, because he might make a point that I was going to make anyway.
Well, no, I think it's easier probably if you finish just now, Provost, rather than come back to you.
No, that's fine. So it does seem a good idea just now to hurry up, to get the process and get the backlog moved. I'm just wanting to ask a question about the bank of questions, because if it gets out, if it's a standard bank of questions, then it's easier for people to know what the questions are and then get the answers already. So I just want to be reassured, and I expect I will be, about how often you change the questions so that you can't get people who know what the questions are in advance, and then it's easy for them to pass it. Although with the pass rate in the past, that might not be a bad idea.
Can I just say something about that? It reminds me of the time when I had to do my medical exams, and the questions often are the same because it's the same competency test. So even if they know what the questions are, it doesn't entirely mean that they're going to be inferior to the person who doesn't know what the questions are, if you get my drift. So I'm not sure in personal experience whether that is important or not, that they know the questions, because if they know the questions, they know the answers, that means they're competent. But I'll let Jerry answer that.
Yeah, the intention, Provost, would be to revisit the questions on a regular basis. So, for instance, if we were having one sitting of an exam, obviously there might be a certain number of questions within that exam, asking a person to identify locations and how they would get to certain locations. We would change those locations for the next test. So the person's knowledge of the area, we have the entirety of East Renfrewshire to pick from in terms of how do you get to a particular site or a particular venue. So we have the ability to vary the questions to make sure that an individual can't walk out one exam, go and speak to their friend and say, by the way, they're looking to identify how you get to Doreen Drive or Main Street or whatever it may be. So yes, we will maintain a bank of questions, and we will rotate those questions for different tests so that it minimises the scope for anybody to effectively cheat.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Okay, Councillor Morrison, please.
Thank you, Chair. Setting aside the written part of the test, the practical part, how many drivers have actually failed, roughly? What kind of proportion of drivers would fail that and therefore not receive their licence or have the licence stopped?
Since we introduced the practical test, while it was initially restricted only to applicants for taxi driver's badges, I only had 2 people who failed the actual test, and both of those, it was purely simply a case of they admitted before we even left the site that we started the test at that they had no idea where they were going to go.
Okay.
So it became pointless actually carrying on with the test. Everybody else exceeded the minimum score of 20 out of 25, and I was more than happy with the driving standard displayed.
How many others were there?
Since we introduced it, I've done approximately 57 tests, all of whom have passed.
So I guess the point I'm getting to, Chair, is the backlog's 120 tests. That's over a 3-4 month period. Extrapolate that across the year, that's quite a significant number of tests being conducted each year. 2 people out of that number is a very insignificant minority, a very insignificant proportion. And that would suggest to me that this element of the test is basically a rubber stamp, and it's not actually adding a lot of value to the process. So on that basis, I'd be happy to accept the recommendations. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, members, are we happy to accept the recommendations? I propose we're happy to accept the recommendations. Is empty dissent? I'm assuming that I declare that we've accepted the recommendations. Okay, next item on the agenda, if there's nothing further in this matter or other similar matters, I'm going to propose that we exclude the press and the public for the remaining items on the agenda. Can you please indicate your agreement to that?
Agreed.
Unanimous agreement there. Can I ask for the recording to be stopped now, please, Jennifer?